First, hello everyone. Thank you for being here this afternoon or evening or wherever, whatever time it is where you're coming in from. Thank you for being here. The structure of this event will first be introductions, then a conversation with Dr. Robert Bashara and Zayed El-Nabalsi, and lastly, some time to take questions and comments. If you have any technical difficulties, feel free to type it in the chat box and we can assist you there. To ask a question or make a comment, feel free to raise your hand to be unmuted to ask yourself, or you can type it in the chat box or the Q&A box and we will address them at the appropriate time. And be sure to keep your eye on the chat box for any links. We have a discount code for Dr. Bashar's book, as well as his websites that you should check out. So I'll start with some introductions. Robert Bashara is the author of Decolonial Psychoanalysis Towards Critical Islamophobia Studies, as well as Freud and Said, Contrapuntal Psychoanalysis as Liberation Praxis. He is also the editor of A Critical Introduction to Psychology and Critical Psychology Praxis, Psychosocial Non-Alignment to Modernity, Coloniality. Further, he is the translator of Murad Waba's 1995 Fundamentalism and Secularization. He is the founder of the Critical Psychology website, criticalpsychology.org, and the director of Critical Psychology Certificate Program at the Center for Global Advanced Studies. Finally, he works as an assistant professor and director of integrated studies at Northern New Mexico College. Zayed El-Nabalsi is a PhD candidate in Africana Studies at Cornell University. He works on African philosophy of culture, African Marxism, the history and philosophy of science in the context of modern African intellectual history, and the history and sociology of philosophy in the context of global intellectual history. His work has appeared in Science and Society, the Journal of African Cultural Studies, the Journal of Historical Sociology, Problemata Revista Internacional de Filosofia, Camp Studies Online, Jadalaya, the Marx and Philosophy Review of Books, and Liberated Text, among others. In Fundamentalism and Secularization, Egyptian philosopher Murad Waba traces the historical origins of fundamentalism and secularization as ideas and practices in order to theorize their symbiotic relationship and how it is impacted by global capitalism and, more recently, postmodernism. Please welcome Dr. Robert Bashara and Zayed El-Nabalsi for a conversation on fundamentalism and secularization.
Thank you very much. So first of all, I would like to thank the Santa Fe Public Library, particularly Ms. Jessica Galford and Friends of the Santa Fe Public Library. I would like to also thank Professor Murad Wahba, Dr. Magdi Murad, and Mr. Zayed El-Nabalsi. Before I start, I would like to acknowledge two anniversaries. On the personal side, my wife and I started dating 15 years ago. On the political side, former Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak was forced to step down 11 years ago amidst a popular uprising. Dr. Murad Wahba is Emeritus Professor of Philosophy at Ain Shams University. He's the author of more than 20 books on philosophy and politics, and the co-editor with Mona Abu Sana of Averroes and the Enlightenment. Finally, he is the founder of the Afro-Asian Philosophy Association. Although Wahba is an Egyptian philosopher, he is really a world philosopher in the truest sense of the phrase, since he synthesizes Euro-American and Afro-Asian philosophies in both of his thinking and writing. In Fundamentalism and Secularization, Wahba traces the philosophical and political origins of fundamentalism and secularization as praxes in an effort to theorize their antithetical relationship throughout history, and how the antagonism is affected by the dialectics of global capitalism and, more recently, postmodernism. I agree with most, if not all, of Wahba's arguments in the book, but I must add a number of caveats which are also reflected in my preceding interview with Professor Wahba. One, Is fundamentalism the best term for explaining the phenomenon of terrorism in the 20th and 21st centuries? If so, how can we make sure that states do not abuse this term to their own advantage? Expressed in a different way, how can we prevent states that claim to be fighting fundamentalists from using this claim as an excuse to oppress dissenting citizens? This question leads to my next point, which concerns the principal intervention against fundamentalism. 2, secularization is neither a dogma nor an ideology. If anything, it is, as an imperfect process, a critical attitude vis-a-vis the theologization of politics. In other words, secularization or de-dogmatization is not concerned with religious peoples, for as a rule, democratic republics must guarantee their citizens and residents, especially minorities, the right to freely practice any or no religion. In that sense, secularization can neither be a violent intervention nor a fixed ideology like secularism or laïcité, as in the case in France. This is why I regard Edward Said's notion of secular criticism and democratic criticism to be crucial safeguards for realizing the process of secularization. 3, like Wahba, I'm equally critical of postmodernism, and I'm not for the wholesale rejection of the Enlightenment either. However, I also believe that we should not overlook the critical modernist analysis of modernity, such as the Frankfurt School's critique of the Enlightenment as totalitarian, or Zygmunt Bauman's argument, it was the rational world of modern civilization that made the Holocaust thinkable. 4, for this reason, I find Enrique Dussels' decolonial concept of transmodernity to be quite helpful here, for it actually names a third worldly attitude vis-a-vis modernity, which I believe is embodied by Wahba's approach in the book, although, to be fair, he does not agree with me regarding this characterization. Transmodernity describes an inclusive or pluriversal vision of the world from the perspective of the oppressed, particularly in the global south. Hence, transmodernity is not a rejection of modernity, but rather an affirmation of both modernity and its alterity, which entails the worlding of philosophy and history, among other fields of knowledge. This affirmation and this worlding certainly entails delinking modernity from coloniality. As such, while bearing the distinction between secularism as a Eurocentric ideology and secularization as a world-centric process in mind, my attempt has been to practice what Lena Salema calls decolonial translation, as a tool for disrupting the epistemic hegemony of coloniality, which she contrasts with colonial forms of non-translation, partial translation, and or mistranslation from Arabic to English vis-a-vis the Islamic tradition in the context of what she terms the coloniality trinity of secularism, state, law. Although the book was originally published in 1995, it is extremely relevant now more than ever, given the current state of world affairs. The specters of religious terrorism, parasitic capitalism, and humanitarian imperialism, not mentioning authoritarianism and fascism. In the book, Wahba posits a number of original theoretical claims, but his central argument concerns the organic or dialectical relationship between religious fundamentalisms and parasitic capitalism on the one hand, and postmodernism on the other hand. Wahba is equally critical of religious fundamentalisms and parasitic capitalism, which for him are obstructions to secularization and democracy. In this sense, I read him as a radical leftist, as opposed to liberal centrist or conservative rightist, which speaks to his world-centric vision vis-a-vis secularization as a process. In other words, I do not think Wahba is inherently against non-secular traditions, for example, Islam, or has an issue with what Talal Asad calls ritualization. Wahba's triple critique is directed equally at 1, fundamentalists qua dogmatists, who claim to be the bearers of the absolute truth, to use his language. 2, parasitic capitalists. And 3, postmodernists. Therefore, his world-centric use of secularization performs a dialectical ideology critique and does not embody a Eurocentric ideology. For example, Wahba approaches the Islamic tradition on its own terms without viewing it through the lens of European Christianity, of which he is equally critical, as is clear from his argument that Edmund Burke is the key theorist of fundamentalism. My aim with translating this book from Arabic to English is to introduce English-speaking students and scholars to an overlooked but noteworthy political philosophical take on salient topics by an author who fares from North Africa. I think it is crucial, particularly for those living in the global North, to consider these topics from the perspective of the global South in order to compare and contrast how the dynamics of religious fundamentalisms manifest themselves in different cultural contexts around the world. The scope of the book is large, for in chapters 1 and 2, Wahba theorizes fundamentalism and secularization as historical ideas before treating them philosophically as political practices. In chapter 3, Wahba focuses on North Africa and West Asia as a case study to demonstrate the antithetical relationship between fundamentalism and secularization, and how the failure of the latter contributes to the success of the former. In chapter 4, Wahba explores the theoretical terrain of postmodernism in an effort to investigate its exacerbation of the fundamentalism-capitalism dialectic. His critique goes to show that religious or traditions are not to be solely blamed for the rise of fundamentalisms during the Cold War and beyond. In chapter 1, Wahba performs an genealogy of fundamentalism, tracing the concept back to Edmund Burke, whose ideas he considers to be at the root of the contemporary conservative Christian movement. This genealogy helps the reader conceptualize the philosophical foundation for two different but related fundamentalist groups today, Christian and Muslim fundamentalists. While these two groups certainly have their differences, they're both essentially a manifestation of a reactionary conservative movement, two sides of the same ideological coin. Fundamentalists are neither reformists like the liberal centrists, nor revolutionaries like the radical leftists. The radical left and Wahhabis, in my opinion, possess the antidote to religious fundamentalisms in the form of a revolutionary socialist program grounded in both secular humanism and radical democracy. The liberal centrists are somewhat responsible, along with the conservative right, for the rise of religious fundamentalisms in the 20th and 21st centuries, with their embrace of what Wahba labels parasitic capitalism, which I understand to mean neoliberalism. But parasitism can also be framed in terms of imperialism as the highest stage of capitalism. For Wahba, parasitic capitalism devours what is against science and reason, that is, everything that leads to absent-mindedness, hence its dialectical relationship with religious fundamentalism as a praxis of literalism, which is inherently antagonistic to interpretation. Interestingly, in my interview with Wahba, he mentions terrorism is the highest stage of religious fundamentalisms. If we stretch Lenin's and Wahba's logics regarding capitalism and fundamentalism, then I would argue that there is also a dialectical or organic relationship between imperialism and terrorism. Wahba's dialectical method vis-a-vis fundamentalism can be characterized as a form of immanent critique, since he deconstructs fundamentalism from within their own logics. For example, Islamic fundamentalism in particular is analyzed through the lens of a Muslim rationalist like Ibn Rushd. Wahba, however, does not single out Islam or Muslims as inherently flawed like an Islamophobic Orientalist would. Instead, he writes, Islam, in terms of being a tolerant religion par excellence, is biased toward peaceful coexistence with other religions. The problem of fundamentalism for him is not specific to Islam. For example, I say fundamentalism without mentioning the Islamic sign because this is fundamentalism, whatever its religious sign may be. And he, in fact, shows that fundamentalism can manifest in relation to the Abrahamic faith as a whole and even beyond. Paul Virilio, for instance, speaks of technological fundamentalism as the religion of those who believe in the absolute power of technology. Like Wahba, Virilio rejects most absolutes, which for him are essentially totalitarian. As an anti-totalitarian, Virilio is in favor of fractalization on the basis of Einstein's theory of relativity. However, for Virilio, as a function of his anarcho-Christianity, there is an exception, an absolute he believes in. You cannot deconstruct the absolute necessity of justice. Is secularization functioning as an absolute then for Wahba, one might ask? No. As a political epistemological process, secularization asks relative or worldly questions, as opposed to providing absolute answers grounded in theological treatments that literalize the sacred. Fundamentalism, then, for Wahba is a function of a literalist attitude vis-a-vis tradition. In other words, as a claim for the absolute truth, fundamentalism is the negation of interpretation. And secularization, he argues, is not an ideological panacea like secularism or laïcité, but the very process of or condition for democratic interpretation, which is always relative. In fact, Wahba regards secularization as a theory of knowledge, the passage to rationalism, and a transfer of power. He defines it as follows: thinking of what is relative in relative terms and not in absolute terms. The conditions for fundamentalism, Wahba argues, are parasitic capitalism and postmodernism, which constitute a fertile ground for the bearers of the absolute truth, who are against both socialism and interpretation respectively. Here I must add that I characterize Wahba as an epistemic relativist, as opposed to a moral relativist, because he clearly has specific values, such as his belief that nothing is beyond interpretation, hence his epistemic relativism. Wahba basically believes that human subjects should be able to critically think, write, and talk about any object of knowledge, including and maybe especially taboo topics. One of Wahba's main themes in the book is that the ideological core of all religious fundamentalisms is more or less the same. This argument is similar to the links that Adam Curtis makes in his documentary film, The Power of Nightmares, The Rise of the Politics of Fear. In the film, Curtis juxtaposes American neoconservatism to militant Islamism in the context of the Soviet-Afghan War, to show the ideological resemblance between these two warring factions. This resemblance between neoconservatism and Islamism is a residue of the United States' material support during the Arab Cold War for a number of Persian Gulf monarchies, which in turn employed Wahhabism in their ideological fight against Arab socialism, particularly its leader Gamal Abdel Nasser. Having said that, it is worth reiterating that Wahba's book was published 6 years before the tragic events of 9/11 and the ensuing and ongoing global war on terror. Consequently, it is fair to assert that this book is ahead of its time. Furthermore, Wahba not only shows us that there is an organic or dialectical relationship between fundamentalisms and capitalism postmodernism. He also provides us in chapter 2 with the necessary tools, for example, secularization, for critically thinking about the world today, particularly in the context of the ceaseless rise of reactionary movements, statist or otherwise. Fundamentalism and secularization demonstrates that the alt-right did not appear out of nowhere. They are a continuation of the New Right, or the moral majority movement spearheaded by Jerry Falwell. In addition to Wahba's extraordinarily accurate prognostic and diagnostic vision, he presents his readers with conceptual tools from the archives of world philosophy. Wahba's world philosophical approach is compelling because he's an erudite scholar who was trained in both Euro-American and Afro-Asian philosophies. This type of intercultural dialogue that he embodies through not only his knowledge, but also his being, is exactly what we need to see more of today. In this vein, Wahba strongly suggests Ibn Rushd as a bridge between the global North and the global South. My task as a translator consisted of sticking as closely as possible to both Wahba's logic and rhetoric. However, the structural differences between Arabic and English as languages from two disparate families, Semitic and West Germanic, respectively, necessitated some flexibility on my part in order for the text's original light to shine through more fully, particularly in instances of cultural difference. For example, the Arabic concept of dawla, which can mean dynasty or cycle, predates the nation state and is closer to the ancient Greek idea of kyklos, i.e. cyclical change. Wael Halak captures the impermanence of dawla when he writes, "Thus the community, ummah, remained fixed and cannot come to an end until the day of judgment, whereas the dawla that governs it is temporary and ephemeral, having no intrinsic, organic, or permanent ties to the community and its sharia. For this reason, I have opted to translate ad-dawla al-Islamiyya as Islamic governance, which literally means al-hukm al-Islami. as opposed to the Islamic State, to bracket unnecessary associations with the infamous terrorist organization ISIL. Also, some terms such as al-Sunnah, I define in more than one way because the word's complexity in Arabic cannot really be rendered using a single word in English. Such polysemous terms I translate while including their transliterations in brackets or vice versa. Furthermore, the Arabic word al-hadatha can signify modernity as an era, modernism as a movement, or modernization as a process. For the most part, Wahba is referring to modernism, but in some cases he is indexing modernity. I tried to discern this difference based on the context in which the word appears. For example, whether the context is a literary aesthetic, such as Sontag's, particularly when contrasted with postmodernism, or a certain historical period that began roughly in the 15th century and which came to fruition with the Enlightenment in the 17th century. The aforementioned flexibility or freedom of linguistic flux speaks to when literal translation, that is fidelity to the word or reproduction of meaning, becomes real translation, that is transparent. After all, the task of the translator entails, as Walter Benjamin reminds us, finding the particular intention toward the target language, which produces in that language the echo of the original. For Benjamin, translation as a form issues from the afterlife of an original text. Derrida similarly indexes the macabre when he characterizes translation as a travail of mourning. In other words, translating is not cloning. Translation is akin to reincarnation. The body of the original text dies in the process, but the text soul remains eternal through reverberation. This eternal or perhaps spiritual dimension, that is the translatability of a text, is what Benjamin means by pure language. Additionally, Wahba's pluriversal vision as a world philosopher who believes, though it contains many diverse cultures, human civilization is one, made the task of translating his book enjoyable, for he's not writing from the perspective of the false clash of civilizations hypothesis. Wahba, in fact, refers instead to the clash of the absolutes as a clash between the fundamentalists of the world, who clearly do not believe in a single human civilization and who may actually be committed to the destruction of said civilization, an anti-humanist impulse that Wahba characterizes as Tatarian. In translating Wahba's masterpiece from Arabic to English, I maintained close fidelity to the spirit of the original text. I also went through Wahba's references, which was fascinating, albeit arduous research process. All of my notes or edits as a translator are included in brackets. Sometimes I have opted to not translate certain Arabic words, but rather to transliterate them or Romanize them, particularly when I found that a certain concept in Arabic, such as Allah, has no real equivalence in English. God is a generic term, but not the specific name of the deity worshipped in the Islamic tradition. Oftentimes, I have included both the translation and the transliteration through the use of brackets. Further, Professor Wahba and I came to an agreement around my use of gender-neutral language. For example, the human instead of man throughout the English translation, with two exceptions. One, unless there is a direct reference cited in the text which employs gendered language, or two, the use of he, him, his as gender pronouns to refer to Allah. This is a linguistic convention in Arabic, so while Allah is not naturally masculine, for he transcends gender, he is grammatically masculine. In addition to part one of this book, which is my translation of Fundamentalism and Secularization, we managed to secure copyright clearances from Wiley in order to include in part two previously published essays by Professor Wahba, The Concept of the Good in Islamic Philosophy and Philosophy in North Africa. These two essays certainly complement some of the themes explored in Fundamentalism and Secularization. In sum, Wahba's foundational ethic is one civilization, many cultures. This secular humanist ethic is, of course, the complete opposite of the propagandistic and reactionary clash of civilizations ideology, which is an imperialist logic sustaining many of the endless wars we continue to bear witness to today. This book, which can be rendered as a material praxis of ideology critique, is intended for students and scholars who are interested in world philosophy and history, critical theory, and geopolitics in general, as well as those who are interested in the Nawa region or the topics of fundamentalism and secularization in particular. Thank you.
Should I go next, or are we having an interlude? Or,
the floor is yours, sir.
Right. Wonderful. Yes, I'd like to extend my thanks to the Santa Fe Public Library for hosting this event, specifically to Ms. Jessica Guilford, and to Robert, of course, for inviting me to participate in this panel, and for his wonderful translation, which is both, readable, renders the Arabic in a readable manner, and is also quite faithful to the original Arabic. And I just want to begin to say that I think by this translation, Robert has rendered a great service to all of those who are interested in contemporary Arabic philosophy. Because simply, I think it's not unfair to say that in the English-speaking world, contemporary Arabic philosophy is fairly unknown. And by that, I mean, if you see, for example, on a department website at a university, a course listed under the title of Arabic philosophy, one wouldn't be entirely mistaken in assuming that the course will be devoted to medieval Arabic philosophy. And so this reduction of Arabic philosophy to medieval philosophy tends to inadvertently or unintentionally present Arabic philosophy or philosophy in Arabic as a dead tradition. And to this extent, I think English translations of contemporary Arabic philosophy are to be welcomed, insofar as they enable us to overturn this inaccurate conception. And as Robert mentioned, so I'll just make some remarks about the content of the book. So as Robert mentions, Wahba's Fundamentalism and Secularization was first published in Egypt in 1995. And the kind of socio-cultural context is one of increasing dominance by Islamist groups of varying degrees of extremism. So if you think, for example, the assassination attempt on Naguib Mahfouz takes place in 1994, so the year before the book is published. And as Bashara notes in his, as Robert notes in his interview with Wahba, which serves as a forward to the translated text, Wahba's book is indeed ahead of its time, insofar as it comes way before the spate of publications on fundamentalism in the aftermath of the events of September 11th, 2001. And it also clearly predicted the coming clash of fundamentalisms, which would go on to shape the first decade of the third millennium, namely the clash between right-wing Christian fundamentalism in the US on the one hand, and expressions of Islamic fundamentalism on the other hand. And as Robert notes, for me, one of the most interesting things about the book is that Wahba refuses to frame this as a conflict of civilizations. So if we think of the thesis advanced by Samuel Huntington in his 1996 book, The Clash of Civilizations, Wahba explicitly rejects this formulation of the issue. For Wahba, as Robert notes, there is in fact, strictly speaking, only one human civilization and many cultures. So Wahba defines civilization as a tiered singularity, the course of which goes from mythical thinking to rational thinking. And here I'd like to remark that it seems that Wahba, in attempting to undermine the thesis of the clash of civilizations, might be criticized for perhaps reintroducing an evolutionist account of a singular human civilization of the sort that was endorsed by, for example, some of the Victorian British anthropologists of the 19th century, just around the time when anthropology was being founded as a discipline. So according to this account, all human societies have more or less the same trajectory towards the same social arrangement that obtained in modern Western societies. And obviously this was Victorian Britain for the Victorian anthropologists. However, some societies have been afflicted by a kind of arrested development, insofar as they have been stuck at a stage of development which they should have transcended. And obviously Victorian anthropologists debated the extent to which this arrested development can ever be overcome, and much of the debate turned around the extent to which the inheritance of acquired characteristics could be overturned. And I think it's not unfair to say that Wahba does seem to have some sympathy with evolutionism as a socio-historical theory. However, it also seems clear that he believes it can be divorced from this colonial heritage, which I think something that that Robert was hinting at. And this leads us to the question of the relationship between colonialism or coloniality, if you like, and modernity in Wahba's philosophy. For Wahba, it seems that modernity is clearly separate from colonialism in conceptual terms. So we can say that there is no relationship of conceptual entailment between the two, even if there is a relationship of actual historical concurrence in terms of real historical time. Robert notes that while he thinks that Wahba's approach in this book instantiates Enrique Dussels' concept of transmodernity, Wahba himself does not agree with this characterization of his own work. And I suspect that one reason why Wahba is hesitant to endorse this concept as a framework for his own work is that Wahba essentially thinks that giving up on evolutionism, on some form of evolutionism, will involve a concession to Islamic fundamentalists in the Arab world in a way that would weaken his commitment to the project of modernity, and this in turn would render his position an instantiation of either abortive modernity or moderate modernity. And these are sort of intellectual currents that are sketched out in chapter 6 of the book. So in the essay translated by Robert, the essay titled Philosophy in North Africa. And it seems to me that perhaps Wahba wants to move away from identifying with these currents. And as Robert notes, so the first chapter of the book deals with fundamentalism, both historically and conceptually. On the conceptual level, Wahba argues that we can understand fundamentalism as essentially driven by the human propensity for oneness or unity, which for Wahba is essentially a yearning for the absolute or the unconditioned. Now, according to Wahba, this is how humans attempt to overcome their alienation in the world, in the universe at large. However, the obvious problem identified by Wahba emerges, which is that absolutes seem to multiply as a function of time. And we do not have any kind of context-independent criteria, which would allow us to decide between competing claims for opposing absolutes. Now, for Wahba, the solution to this problem is to simply give up on the search for absolutes and to endorse a kind of relativism, epistemic relativism, as Robert notes. However, it's important that for Wahba, relativism does not imply that anything goes. Wahba defines relativism in negative terms, simply as the rejection of the thesis that knowledge claims can ever be of an absolute nature. I think this makes Wahba's relativism quite close to the relativism which is endorsed by, for example, the philosophical spokesperson for the strong program in the sociology of science, David Bloor. So some of you are familiar with, the so-called science wars and stuff. David Bloor might be a familiar name. So again, like Bloor defines relativism in negative terms. So he says all knowledge is conjectural, all knowledge is partial, all knowledge is open to revision. Scientific theories always have some point at which they break down. Scientific theories nearly always, possibly always, but certainly nearly always get some things right and some things wrong. They get things right to a certain degree of approximation and so on. So the idea is that basically it is not that we cannot arrive at, if you like, optimal solutions in specific contexts, but that we cannot simply make knowledge claims that are context independent or that are without any qualifications. Now, what's especially interesting for me is that Wahba presents himself as a proponent of the Enlightenment as a universal project. However, unlike many participants in, say, the contemporary culture wars of North America, he seems to think that commitment to the Enlightenment project with its attendant secularization entails a commitment to the rejection of absolutism and epistemology. In other words, the commitment to relativism as defined above is presented by him as a requirement of rationality and not as a product of its rejection. And for Wahba, fundamentalism confounds the absolute with the relative, the eternal truth with the transient truth, whereas secularization, by contrast, as a world historical process, involves coming to think of, as Robert mentions, what is relative in relative terms and not in absolute terms. Now, since for Wahba all human phenomena are relative, this requires that we think about them in relative terms. However, this raises the question of whether relativism in this sense is consistent with Wahba's evolutionist philosophy of history, and perhaps this is something we can discuss. I'd like to hear what Robert thinks about this and what our audience thinks about this. Now, it seems that for Wahba, human history ought to develop in such a manner that one civilization characterized by the endorsement of epistemic relativism would come to be predominant, or it would express itself in a more actual form through different cultures. Now, it's not clear that this philosophy of history is compatible with Wahba's endorsement of anti-absolutism. Rather, it seems that Wahba has not negated the absolute so much as he has temporalized and historicized this. And in this respect, there is a kind of Hegelian moment in his thought. Now, it seems to me that Robert is correct insofar as he thinks that Wahba perhaps has to abandon his evolutionism and adopt something like the concept of transmodernity if he is to be consistent with his own absolutism, with his own anti-absolutism. For to take an evolutionist standpoint, both descriptive and normative with respect to philosophy of history would seem to imply that there is a supra-historical vantage point from which we can compare different societies and ascertain the kind of society that all societies ought to tend towards, even if that society is itself characterized by an enlightened acceptance of epistemic relativism. Now, in the historical narrative, which is provided by Wahba also in chapter 1, he traces, as Robert mentions, the history of fundamentalism from Edmund Burke to the American moral majority movement, which was founded by Jerry Falwell in 1979. Now, by pointing out Burke as a fundamentalist, Wahba is essentially making the claim that fundamentalism is an anti-revolutionary movement. I mean, if you think of what Burke is most famous for, is of course his reflections on the revolution in France, which kind of depicted the French Revolution as a kind of outburst of fanaticism and as potentially leading to the collapse of French society and so on. And while we may think of Burke as an anti-fundamentalist, I think insofar as we associate fundamentalism with fanaticism of the sort that people often ascribe to the French Revolution, specifically revolutionary terror, French revolutionary terror, Wahba doesn't seem to agree. However, one wonders the extent to which he overstates Burke's influence, because Burke, in the immediate aftermath of his passing, he seems to have had few faithful followers in English politics. One also wonders why Wahba doesn't pay more attention to Burke's emphasis on the importance of context-sensitive assessments of political action. So this we could think of insofar as he has a kind of epistemic position in politics. It's always about the emphasis on context sensitivity. Now, I think such an emphasis would make it seem that Burke is close to Wahba, insofar as the latter thinks we should think relatively in relation to things that are relative. However, notwithstanding questions about his reading of Burke, we may note that Wahba has pointed out something important, very important here in my view, namely that there is a type of conservative fundamentalist who makes the following illegitimate inference. So starting with the premise, all we have is sort of common life, or common everyday existence, and the normative standards that can be made explicit by reflecting on excuse me, on the practices of common life. Therefore, common life and its practices are sacred and they must always be protected. Now, this concept of common life is derived from David Hume's usage of that concept. So, for example, Hume, in his inquiry concerning human understanding, he writes, philosophical decisions are nothing but the reflections of common life, methodized and corrected. Now, the conservative standpoint is what one arrives at, I think, when we take this Humean approach to the limits of human reason while forgetting about Hume's skepticism, which also extends to customs and common life. Now, when one forgets about the skeptical element in this picture, one tends to absolutize and sanctify tradition. And this is quite far, for example, from David Hume's own thinking. So Hume writes in his treatise, probably his most famous book, methinks I'm like a man who, having stuck on many shoals and having narrowly escaped shipwreck in passing a small frith, has yet the temerity to put out to sea in the same leaky, weather-beaten vessel, and even carries his ambition so far as to think of compassing the globe under these disadvantageous circumstances. Now, these are not really the words of a philosopher who would seek solace in a mystified conservative conception of tradition, even if he's willing to concede that all philosophical reflection is parasitic on the practices of common life. Now, the fundamentalist, and I think the image of the fundamentalist that Wahba's portraying, which I think is quite accurate, by contrast, is unable to accept his this permanent vulnerability. And hence, he or she seeks to absolutize what is relative. The fundamentalist cannot understand that modern life, to quote a passage from Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, is not the life that shrinks from death and keeps itself untouched by devastation, but rather the life that endures it and maintains itself in it. And this is really, I think, the kind of orientation towards human existence that one would have to accept if we accept that we must rid the secular world, if you will, of any claims to absolutism. And here I'll just make some, perhaps a very minor comment about Wahba's account of fundamentalism. I think he makes a fairly minor historical mistake when he tends to take the fundamentalists at their own word when he's writing the history of fundamentalism in the United States. Because I think, for example, Wahba's historical account of the rise of the new right in the US seems to underplay the importance of the struggle against racial desegregation to the new right. So contrary to popular belief, for example, abortion was not initially the issue around which the American new right was galvanized. That comes later on. Initially, it was about desegregation in these private Southern Baptist-run universities. But anyway, that's sort of just a minor comment. Now, in chapter 2, Wahba provides his historical and conceptual account of secularization. Wahba sees the modern scientific revolution as a pivotal event for the process of secularization, especially Galileo's insistence that science and religion were totally different enterprises with different methods of investigation. Now, Galileo leveraged this difference in order to argue for the importance of the autonomy of science. On Galileo's view, theologians could, of course, try to show how scientific discoveries were consistent with the claims of biblical historical revelation, but they could not tell scientists or natural philosophers how to proceed in their investigation of nature. It was up to the scientists to ascertain how best to proceed in understanding natural phenomena. For Wahba, this essentially means that appeals to the absolute were prohibited in the discourse of natural science or natural philosophy. For him, secularization is thus essentially a historical process whereby humans come to accept that they must think in relative terms in relation to that which is relative. And they gradually come to extend the extension of the concept relative things such that more and more things are subsumed under it. Now, he thus interprets the modern scientific revolution as a step towards the embrace of relativism. We can say that for Wahba, relativism, epistemic relativism, is the telos of modern science, or rather, it's the telos of accurate meta-scientific accounts of modern science. But this is, again, very interesting because what Wahba is doing is, this is not a kind of anti-science argument, which again is often associated with a relativist position. So I think there is also like a lot of originality in Wahba's thinking in relation to this particular issue. Now, in his analysis of fundamentalism in Egypt, Wahba shows that he is influenced by historical materialism, as Robert notes, because he tries to show the way in which the rise of what he calls parasitic capitalism in Egypt in the 1970s, so capitalism where profits are produced through speculation and mercantile activities without production, led to a kind of intellectual decadence and fostered the development of fundamentalism. In the third chapter, Wahba deals with the history of the struggle between fundamentalism and secularization in the Middle East. Now, Wahba thinks of fundamentalism in the region as essentially a modern phenomenon. It's not some sort of archaic medieval thing, which again is, if we think of how it's depicted in the media, it's sort of something coming back from the past to haunt the present, when in fact it is the child of the present. For according to Wahba, fundamentalism, religious fundamentalism in the Middle East was born to fill the gap which emerged as the result of the failure of pre-existing, if we can say, traditional institutions in the region. Now, these institutions relations collapsed in the face of an encounter with a modern or modernizing West from, say, let's say the first sort of point of real contact for the Arab world was, for example, Napoleon's invasion of Egypt, and this continues through the 19th century to the 20th century, of course. Now, there is a dual failure here: the failure of these institutions to adapt and the failure of indigenous modernizing projects. So if we can think of Muhammad Ali's, for example, modernizing project in Egypt, or similar modernization projects in Tunisia that took Muhammad Ali's project as a model, for instance. And obviously, earlier, the Ottoman attempt to modernize. These projects failed, sometimes due to Western intervention. So this is the case, for example, with Muhammad Ali in Egypt. Now we can say that for Wahhabi fundamentalism in the Middle East is essentially a pathological reflection in what Marxists would call the superstructure of a more fundamental pathology in the base of those societies. For in those societies, capitalism has not done away with archaic social relations. Rather, it has formally subsumed them. But this process of subsumption has been interrupted. What Marx called real subsumption, where sort of capitalists go in and kind of totally, if you will, rationalize production processes and overturn perhaps older social relations and so on. This, for the most part, has not occurred. What this means is that while capitalism may be dominant in those social formations, it does not revolutionize productive forces and transform social relations to the same degree of intensity as it does when real subsumption has taken place. So, and the way that happened in the West, for instance, in Europe and North America. Now, I think implicit in Wahhaba's narrative is the thesis that colonialism, far from aiding the secularization process in the Middle East, has in fact placed fetters on it. Wahhaba notes the rise of a liberal or proto-liberal intellectual current in Egypt in the 18th and 19th centuries. So it's exemplified in the first generation by people like Hassan al-Attar, people like his student Rafat Tahtawi, and later on by Sheikh Ali Abdel Razik, and figures like Khalid Muhammad Khalid, and later on Taha Hussein. However, this liberal current quickly found itself outmaneuvered by Islamists who accused it of collaborating with the British colonial authority and of attacking traditional norms just at the moment when these norms were perceived to be under attack from a foreign colonizing power. Now, in response to this pressure, the members of the liberal current gradually abandoned the project of secularization and opted for what we can say perhaps is a nationalist united front. Now, at the level of conceptual analysis, Wahhaba argues that the key thesis, which is adhered to by fundamentalists, is the claim that practical knowledge, knowledge of worldly affairs, is derived from religious knowledge. Wahhaba argues that if by religious knowledge we mean knowledge of necessary truths about God's existence and nature, then we cannot derive knowledge of contingent truth regarding our worldly affairs from the former. Now, Wahhaba seems to be pointing out that insofar as it appears that religious knowledge can serve as a basis for practical knowledge, this is only the result of the illicit smuggling in of statements of contingent truth regarding relative things, which are then disguised by the fundamentalist as statements of necessary truth about the absolute. I'll just say maybe perhaps, I don't know how much time I have left, maybe 5 minutes. Robert, do you know?
You have time.
Okay. So I'll just go through the rest of what I have. I mean, as you can tell, this book is really, it's a very stimulating book, and it can be, I think, taken in different directions in terms of how we interpret it. But let me sort of maybe try to say a couple of things more about the specific issues that are raised. So in the fourth and last chapter of this book, Wahhaba deals with the relationship between postmodernism and fundamentalism. Now, Wahhaba puts forward the interesting thesis that postmodernism and fundamentalism are similar insofar as they both reject the authority of reason, and with that, the possibility of rule-governed interpretation. Wahhaba's argument is rather difficult to follow here, but perhaps what he means is the following. Postmodernism, while being relativistic, adopts a crude form of relativism, the anything goes form of relativism, but this renders interpretation in any normal sense impossible, precisely because it renders all interpretations valid. On the other hand, fundamentalism rejects interpretation insofar as it puts forward one purportedly transparent and divinely sanctioned interpretation of the text as the final incorrigible interpretation. The unlimited multiplicity of competing interpretations between which we cannot rationally decide, on the one hand, so postmodernism, and the absolutization of a single interpretation both lead to the same result, namely determination and prohibition of the process of interpretation. In addition to the book, as Robert mentions, Robert has also translated 2 essays of Wahba's, and they have been appended as chapters 5 and 6. So chapter 5 provides an account of the concept of the good in Islamic philosophy. In this chapter, Wahba is concerned with detecting secular, or we can say proto-secularist tendencies in Islamic philosophy. He finds such tendencies exemplified in Al-Farabi's rejection of divine command theory, and in Ibn Rushd's secularization of the concept of the good through his championing of allegorical interpretation of religious texts, especially when they contradict the dictates of demonstrative philosophical reasoning. However, it seems for me that Wahba is perhaps equivocating a bit here. For while Ibn Rushd does indeed defend some kind of autonomy for philosophy, but not complete autonomy, we still have to remember that this is a medieval context, and even Ibn Rushd didn't claim a complete autonomy for philosophy from religion. But it's also not at all clear that Ibn Rushd was an epistemic relativist, which, if we remember Wahba's definition of secularization in the book, in the main text, he defines it in terms of relativism. For the common way in which the term secularization or secularism is used denotes the separation of religious and worldly authorities. However, this does not by itself imply rejection of absolutism in the realm of epistemology. Indeed, the idea that philosophy is capable of demonstrative certainty, at least in relation to some realms of knowledge, is a key feature of Ibn Rushd's thought. Hence, when Ibn Rushd compares the reasoning of the jurist, al-faqih, with the reasoning of the philosopher, he writes, the jurist has only a syllogism based on supposition, whereas the one who is cognizant, so the philosopher, has a syllogism based on certainty. Moreover, Wahba seems to perhaps discount Ibn Rushd's elitism, for while Ibn Rushd allowed for interpretation, this was only allowable for those who are proficient in demonstrative reasoning. So Ibn Rushd writes in his famous treatise, Fasl al-Maqal, the decisive treatise, for anyone not adept in science, al-ilm, it is obligatory to take them. So here he's talking about descriptions of the afterlife, in the Quran. Ibn Rushd is saying it is obligatory to take them in their apparent sense. For him, that is the person who is not adept in science, it is unbelief, kufr, to interpret them, because it leads to unbelief. Moreover, there is also a clear sense in which Ibn Rushd is not a forerunner of secularization as defined by Wahba. For Ibn Rushd's argument about the harmony between philosophy and religion presupposes that the aim of philosophy is the investigation of the divine order. This is what his argument hinges on, so that the aim of philosophy is the investigation of the absolute. However, it seems to me that Wahba, as a relativist, doesn't seem to think that this is the aim of philosophy. And finally, I'll just say a brief word about chapter 6. Wahba provides an overview of different currents of philosophy in North Africa in chapter 6. The first current that he identifies is traditionalism, which attempted to modernize Muslim societies without questioning what Wahba refers to as Islamic dogma. This current is represented by people like Jamal al-Din al-Afghani, Muhammad Abdu. Now, the second current is represented by figures like Yusuf Karam, Zaki Naguib Mahmoud, Abdurrahman Badawi, Malik bin Nabi in Algeria. What unifies this set of thinkers, according to Wahba, is their attempt to tame modernity by undermining the necessity of secularization for modernization. So they want to divorce the two processes. However, for Wahba, this is an incoherent standpoint. This brings us to the third current, namely moderate modernity. Moderate modernity is instantiated in the work of Muhammad Arkoun and Muhammad Abdul Jabri. This current attempts to reinterpret cultural tradition within a secular context, and to this extent, it seems to be the one that's closest to Wahba's own approach. I'd be interested to hear what Robert thinks about this and what the audience thinks about this. But I think this last chapter leaves us with a question which I'd like to pose, is what kind of social, economic, political, and intellectual conditions make it so that Arabic philosophical discourse cannot move away from taking the question of its relation to its tradition, turath, as its primary problematic? How are we to describe and perhaps transcend this historical impasse? While Wahba's book does not answer these questions directly, I think it points towards their significance for any attempt to grasp the current dilemmas of contemporary philosophy in Arabic. I'll conclude here. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ziad. So do we have any questions?
Nothing in the chat or Q&A yet, but if anyone has any questions, comments, feel free to raise your hand to be unmuted. You can also write in the chat or the Q&A box, and I will read them.
Okay, I can comment on something while we wait. So, I mean, one thing that I believe from reading this text in Arabic and other texts by Wahba, he does not reject the concept of the absolute per se, and you probably got that sense. And so what he problematizes is this notion that you see it repeated throughout, the bearers of the absolute truth. So in other words, the question for him is like, who gets to speak for the absolute? Who gets to represent the absolute? And who can make that claim? That's for him really the problem. And it tends to be, historically speaking, from his observation, especially looking at politics, tends to be those who have the literalist approach, right? So the problem is not with the absolute per se. So, and that's why I say he's an epistemic relativist and not a moral relativist, right? And that's why he also takes issue with postmodernism, right? Where there's this notion of anything goes, any interpretation is equally valid, or so that's important to point out, that he's not against the absolute or absolute. He problematizes that conception because of its effect on the political, right? And especially because it tends to be reactionary folks that he calls dogmatists or fundamentalists that tend to speak for the absolute truth, right? So that's something that's important to point out.
Thank you. Matthew Gilmore has their hand raised. I'm going to allow you to talk. Feel free to unmute yourself.
Hi, yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, okay. I actually had two questions. Robert actually mostly answered my second one. Just insofar as it seems very difficult to have something like an ethos of interpretation without a relation to something like a non-relational or an absolute of some kind, even if there's nothing representing it. Otherwise, I don't really see how this relativism really differentiates itself from secularization. So, but I think that's somewhat clarified in what Robert said. My first question, though, was for Robert, like, when you said you have a problem with naming fundamentalism, which was your kind of first proviso for introducing the text, is it a matter of arriving at a more adequate name for fundamentalism, or is there something already perhaps too secularizing in identifying a name for something like fundamentalism? Or is there a better word for it that we should use, or is there something problematic in the way that we approach the problem of fundamentalism as this reactionary conservatism to the process of secularization and so on and so on? So thank you.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. Yeah, I did raise that question actually with my interview. So let me actually read to you what I said. And part of my issue with the term, I'm fine with accepting it the way Wahba is using it. My question really is more about when states abuse the term for political ends, merely as a way to, as a weapon against any form of political dissent, then it could be labeled as fundamentalism. And so that's really my concern. But in any case, I did ask him about other terms such as puritanical, extremist, fanatic, and I wanted to hear what he thinks. And he said that these terms are vague expressions which have been circulating over the ages. Therefore, their use produces a generalization concerning the phenomenon of fundamentalism, which is a phenomenon specific to the 20th century and beyond. Also, fundamentalism, he adds, precisely determines the enemy's nature. The fundamentalist is a terrorist, since terrorism is the highest stage of religious fundamentalisms. So he has a very specific, basically philosophical theoretical explanation of, you know, the terrorist, how the fundamentalist becomes a terrorist, in other words, and he connects it to, and I think that's honestly the most fascinating aspect of the book, how he connects it with, if it was just completely without any context, it wouldn't have been as interesting. But because he relates it to capitalism, especially parasitic capitalism and postmodernism, that triangle, that there's like a theoretical triangle connecting those three phenomena. And so by having those three interrelated, we see the kind of fundamentalism we see today. So you can't just talk about fundamentalism without talking also about capitalism, without also talking about postmodernism. And I had imperialism in there as well, because he invokes Lenin. If you notice, he talks about terrorism. It's the highest stage of religious fundamentalism. So I thought that was interesting that he was indexing Lenin indirectly there, right? I saw some questions in the chat.
Yeah, there's a couple, and they're related. There's also comments about how fantastic this presentation has been. So let's see, I don't know who this is from, but Robert, did you encounter any translation challenges along the way? And then the next question that is related, could you speak a little more about this challenge of translating in general? In this instance, from Arabic to English, and potentially losing meaning along the way?
Well, I did talk a little bit about that earlier. I think one of the hardest one was the concept of al-dawla. And it's very hard to translate it. And so I tried to kind of go through my thinking about that. When I translate it as governor, it's not a very accurate translation, but it's, I think, the one that's closest to the meaning that I believe Wahba has in his mind. So I'm lucky though, because, you know, I was able to speak with Wahba and have conversation with him, and he got to also read my translation and give me comments. So it was a dialogical process, you know, and so not everyone has that privilege to be able to go back to the original author. And so he, in fact, told me that the translation impressed him so much that he considered me a co-author, which was kind of humbling to hear that from him. But the difficulties really regarding certain concepts that if you translate them without context, you lose a lot. So I talked about also Allah. You can translate that as God, but you lose the specificity, especially if it's in relation to Islam. Now, if you're talking about religion in general and just a deity, then you can say God. But so, you know, you keep that in mind, while at the same time using transliterations or romanization. I try not to overdo it, but it's there as well. But in general, yeah, as I mentioned as well, it's been a very enjoyable process translating this book. And by the way, I should plug in that Ziad is translating another book by Murad Wahba. Do you want to talk a little bit about that to kind of anticipate some?
Yeah, I can say something briefly. Yeah, so I'm translating his book Madkhal ila Tanmir. So Again, so Tanwir is sort of, I guess it's still it's difficult to translate the title even, because the Tanwir could be, a verb, where you're enlightening, or the Enlightenment as, a kind of historical period. Yeah, and I think, for the most part, what really helps is that Wahba is also the author of a philosophical dictionary, which really helps a lot from English to, English and Arabic. So if you can sort of look at, if there is a technical term, you look at how he translates it. So that makes things much easier. But some of the main difficulties, because it is a kind of historical overview of Enlightenment philosophy, and while I do have some competence in that area, there are some thinkers whose work I don't know, and then it becomes quite difficult. You actually have to go almost, and as Robert indicated, you have to go study what Wahba studied to make sense of it, so you can actually come up with a coherent translation.
Yeah, I mean, that's really what takes time, because the translation itself didn't take a long time. But what took a long time was finding the references, and some of those books were out of print, that he was using in order so I can read what he was reading and get a sense of how he came across these sources and what he was thinking about, in order to really understand the context and do a good job in that way. So that process takes time to be able to read all of that. And I should also say that so with Gerlach Press in Germany, I'm editing a series called the Murad Wahba series. We're translating a number of books, and this is something that I'm very passionate about, as Ziad mentioned earlier. Arabic philosophy a lot of times is presented as a dead tradition with a lot of focus on medieval philosophy. So it's like an important task for me that I impose on myself to translate contemporary texts by Arabic theorists from the whole region. So Murad Wahba is a fascinating thinker and philosopher that I'm paying attention to in this period, but I have other projects planned for the future in a similar vein. So I just wanted to mention that, so you know that there are more translations coming soon.
Thank you. If there is any more questions or comments, feel free to raise your hand or write it in the chat Q&A. While we wait to see if there's any more, I just want to thank Dr. Bashara and Ziad and the Basli a million times for doing this program with the library and sharing your wisdom and translation with the world. This is a very engaging and important conversation. So thank you both so much for doing this with us. And then, of course, thanks to the Friends of the Santa Fe Public Library. Without their support, we wouldn't get to have such incredible events like this. For all of you, there is a discount code in the chat. I'll put it there again, in case you're interested in purchasing Fundamentalism and Secularization. Dr. Bashar has generously provided this code. I'm putting it in the chat now. Also, be sure to discover more about Dr. Bashar and his work at robertbashara.com. I don't see any.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. So thank you everyone for being here this afternoon.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ziad.
Good luck with all of your work.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're both very impressive people.
We appreciate the support.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Everyone take care, read books. Fundamentalism and Secularization. Bye.
Bye.